Hi everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Lexington Parade. Hello there. The demonstration of Grays Harbor's cannery workers and fishermen yesterday was impressive, and it reminded old-timers of many other demonstrations that have been staged at one time or another in a variety of causes. And there have been some good ones too. There were the labor parades back in 1935 during the summer of the big strike. There have been some political demonstrations, such as those that wound through the streets of Aberdeen and Hoquiam during the bitter campaigns between Hughes and Wilson back in the teens, and the parade of the Roosevelt-Hoover campaign in 1932. Then there were the demonstrations against the IWW back in the teens, when aroused harbor citizens ran the troublemaking Wobblies out of town. But I can recall no demonstration to compare with the Lexington Parade of 1917. It was one parade in which almost everyone in Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis joined. The governor of the state participated. The harbor talked about for months afterwards, yes, years afterwards. Now, to understand how the harbor could have staged such a demonstration, we need to rake over the coals of the fire that burned so brightly in those days, just after America's entry into the war in 1917. The spirit that had been generated in the community during the days when the Kaiser was America's #1 propaganda target, the lines of boys who swamped the recruiting office immediately after President Wilson had asked for men to fill the ranks of service, the men too old to go who wanted to work for a victory over the Central Powers, all these had fanned the war fever to a high pitch, and when the president called for a nationwide observance of Lexington Day, well, Grays Harbor answered with everything that it had. It was just 12 days after President Woodrow Wilson had stood up before the Joint House of Congress and called for a state of war with Germany and the Central Powers. And someone must have noticed that it was the anniversary of the Battle of Lexington, when a handful of colonies had stood their ground and told each other, if they want war, let it begin here. It was in the minds of those charged with stirring up the nation to a fighting pitch, the day for the big demonstration of national unity. So hardly had the boys started to enter the training camps than the towns and cities across the nation prepared to demonstrate in a big way for the Lexington Day program. On Grays Harbor, there were several schemes. One was for a mass parade that would combine the marches of both cities, but that didn't go so well, because it was a very long way between towns, and Simpson Avenue was not the paved link between that it is today. So finally, it was decided that there would be simultaneous turnouts in both towns, with everyone in town in the line of the march. Aberdeen's community was headed up by George Wolfe, the public-spirited local merchant, and Mayor J.M. Phillips named a string of other local men to help him. And for the 4 days preceding the parade, the newspaper bombarded the citizens with appeals to get out and get into the line to march. The mills that were running 2 8-hour shifts and preparing a third announced that they would shut down for the parade and that the workers would be in the line. The shipyards that had not yet started their war contracts but were negotiating for them announced that they would stop the boat building and get into the line for the march. In Hoquiam, the Civil War Veterans Association was slated to be at the head of the parade, with Governor Lister and every musician in the town to be lined up to participate in one of the musical groups being strung together. It appeared that the procession would be the largest ever staged on the harbor, and of course, everyone prayed for good weather. But it was not to be. The morning of the 18th of April, 1917, dawned damp and dreary. The officials were determined to go through with every detail, however, rain or shine. The parades were timed to begin during the dinner hour. The Aberdeen procession to move off promptly at 6:30, and at 6:20, 10 minutes before the parades began to roll, the mill of the harbor began to set up a dim of whistles that was heard in Montesano. It was the signal to fall into line, and they did. The head of the Aberdeen procession was located at the old Washington Hotel on the corner of Heron and K Streets, and at 6:30 the street in front of the hotel was jammed with marchers. Many were workers carrying their dinner plates. As they moved off, 3 bands spaced along the line of the march, and fife and drum corps, the veterans of the wars between the states, were all in the line, along with such patriotic characters as Paul Revere on a horse, half a dozen Uncle Sams, and the Spirit of 76 trio that marched piping and drumming near the head of the procession. There were a few floats and some rolling displays, but not one automobile bearing honorary guests or distinguished citizens. Everyone walked. The Aberdeen Elks Lodge carried their big new flag with 80 men surrounding it, holding at its seams. 50 other larger flags marked the line of the march, and thousands of smaller flags were carried by each of the marchers. The Orpheus Club marched in a body and sang lustily the patriotic songs Over There, and had not yet hit the music shops. But Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, and the Battle Hymn of the Republic were rendered. There was a unit of the Naval Reserve, which had been formed up and was ready to go overseas. It was one of several naval divisions formed on Grays Harbor, and there were troops in khaki. And they marched and marched, and it rained until Uncle Sam's stripes ran, and his stars wept. The grease paint ran off the faces of the Spirit of 76, but it didn't dampen the spirit of the demonstrators, for this was the first chance to show a united front against the enemy, and it was patriotism at a fever pitch. For 2 hours, the marchers passed the corner of Broadway and Heron. More than 7,000 Aberdeen citizens were in the line of the march. Meanwhile, in Hoquiam, the scene was being duplicated with a slight change of background. The Norwegian and Swedish clubs marched en masse, and the Scandinavian Choral Society marched bareheaded in the rain with the flag at the head of their column, singing lustily all the way. The rain ran down their faces and soaked most of them to the skin, but not one of them dropped out of the line of the march. The Civil War vets, who had once marched with Sherman and Grant, plodded along through the drizzle in their faded blue uniforms. The Hoquiam parade broke up to permit the participants to attend the programs. There was no hall in town large enough to handle the thousands of marchers, so the program was divided into sections, with audience filling the high school auditorium, the Elks Temple, and the Arcade and Liberty Theaters. Every building was filled to overflowing, and Governor Lister went to all of them, to the hall in Hoquiam to make his talk before the rain-soaked patriots before he came over to Aberdeen to repeat his performance. In Aberdeen, the line of march ended at the Grand Theater, and while the old Grand was the harbor's largest show house, it could not hold only a fraction of the thousands who wanted to hear the governor and watch the rest of the programs. So when the auditorium had been filled from the gallery to the pit, and one of the bands had crowded into the orchestra pit to play for the doings, W.H. Tucker, an Aberdeen attorney, paid a tribute to the flag. The Orpheus Club sang the national anthem, and attorney Arthur Cross recited the Ride of Paul Revere. Then the governor was rushed onto the stage, fresh from his talkathon and hoquiam, and the audience went wild with enthusiasm. Outside the theater, where they could hear nothing but the sounds of the feet squishing inside their soaking shoes and the rain dripping off the ends of their noses, the thousands who had joined the march stood and cheered when they heard the cheers from inside the building. And when the governor came out through the lines of packed marchers, you could hear the cheering in Cosmopolis. Everyone agreed that it was the greatest day in Grays Harbor's history up to that time, and went home to soak their feet in hot water and wring out their hats and jackets. But the spell that the Lexington day had cast over the harbor did not wear off in a day or two. It served the purpose that the national promoters of the day had hoped for. It stirred the public to a fever of patriotic enthusiasm that hung on for months and helped to unite the harbor folks behind the war effort, the biggest national cause that the nation had faced up until that time. There were probably some large-scale demonstrations of public pride and spirit during the late war. We missed those. But we can recall the excitement as the everyone in line spirit was swept over the harbor in 1917 when the towns turned out to observe Lexington Day and to show the Northwest and the nation that Grays Harbor and all behind the drive to oust the Kaiser and make the world safe for democracy was well and strong in Grays Harbor. And when old-timers talk about the demonstration and parades and public spirit, they often harken back to the 18th of April 1917, when residents of the harbor cities trudged through the rain in files that stretched for miles as an expression of their support for their government at the war with the aggressor, and to make a place for themselves tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.